Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us today at Umutofi on this lovely Saturday afternoon. My name is Kina, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you the esteemed guest today, Zi Hao. So, besides being an artist, Zi Hao is also a bundle of many other talents and skills. He's also a writer, educator, researcher, and also a lecturer. And his work and interdisciplinary approach challenges how we see and understand the system around us. And his practice extends across visual arts, creative writing, and also culture research. So today, Zi Hao will be sharing with us insights into the conceptual history and also linguistic thread of our topic of discussion today, the weirding praxis of casebearer and lexicographer. So without further ado, Zi Hao.
Thank you. Thank you, Kina, for inviting me over to provide this, to give this presentation. And also thank you for all of you who chose to come on a Saturday and for taking an interest in the topics of my research. So when I was invited to give this presentation, I was thinking about maybe I should use it as an opportunity to share some of my ongoing process where I'm currently working on a book project. So as a researcher, I'm working on a few papers, but also as an artist, as a practitioner, I'm also trying to think about how to make certain connections across my practice. So this presentation is a work in progress, and it's also an attempt to make sense of some of the threads that I've been exploring. Okay. So the title, To Carry a World, the presentation will be divided into 4 specific sections. The first is about basically just a brief opening, the world and the crowd. The second, moth-eaten futures, where I'm going to talk about household case-bearers, specific tiny little creatures. And third, about portable worlds, where I'm going to talk about dictionary writers, lexicographers. Specifically, I'm going to focus on one lexicographer, a Malaysian lexicographer who recently passed away, unfortunately. His name is Yang Gui. And finally, I'm going to do some kind of wrap-up, concluding how through these 2 different cases, the case bearers and also the lexicographer, we can think about worlding as a form of weirding. I'll explain those terms later on. So let's begin with something that I believe many of us might be familiar with, right? A film by Charlie Chaplin. As an opening, I think this film, Modern Times, is quite interesting in the sense that it starts with an image of a clock. Yeah. Sort of reminding us to keep time, to be in time. And the film, if you're familiar with the film, if you've watched the film, it's a film about workers working in a factory and trying to keep up with time. So there's an element of time management, timekeeping, and monitoring. What is interesting about this film is that the opening of this film basically shows us a flock of sheep, yeah, and that flock of sheep gradually fades into people, yeah, a crowd that kind of coming out of the subway, underground subway, and then gradually shift to another scene where we see people actually crossing the street, the road, to join the crowd that is at the center, as if they are kind of lining up, queuing up to enter into the factory that is behind us. Why would I open with this scene is that I feel that the very transition, yeah, from a flock of sheep to a crowd of people feels to me as if there's a certain kind of conjuring of the crowd as an undifferentiated mass. Yeah, we see it, the particular scene from top down. Yeah, so we're seeing it from a particular angle that is already not human, and we see them as an undifferentiated crowd. Yeah, they are not just individual persons; they are people. They are a singular and not a plural. Then what is interesting about this particular scene is that we begin to see that the camera shifts from a ground level, and we have people moving across the street to join the crowd at the opposite. And at that moment, it feels as if we are part of the crowd, yeah, because we are crossing the street and we are walking from the camera's position towards the distance, across the distance, to join the crowd. And it's quite interesting that in the middle, what is separating from the eye and the crowd is actually the passing of cars, yeah, as perhaps a symbol of technology, of machines and speed. And as the car passes, the person basically just walk across the street and join the crowd. And at this particular moment, out of a sudden, you might notice that, we are actually part of the crowd. There's something about the I and the crowd that I'm looking at. And I want to use this opening as a way of introducing two cases, two specific examples, the case bearers and also a lexicographer. Perhaps another way of illustrating this problem that I'm trying to unpack is that imagine yourself, you are walking within or together with the crowd, and out of a sudden you stumble upon yourself in the mirror by accident, and you're surprised by the fact that you notice yourself in the crowd. And at that particular moment, you begin to slow down, a pause. And at that moment, when you begin to reflect upon yourself, you notice that you become aware of your existence. You notice a familiar face amongst the crowd. And at that moment, the crowd, the I, the self precipitates, it emerges. While at the same time, the distinction of the crowd or the people begins to evaporate. And the crowd becomes those people, whereas the I emerge. And I think there's something interesting about this. Our distinction, the distinction of the self, is recognized at the expense of the distinction of others. So as the I emerge, the other people, the other I's become indistinct. So there's a simultaneous process of distinguishing the I and the self and not distinguishing the others as individuated selves. So at this moment, the I precipitates and the crowd becomes those people, kind of like, in media studies, we have this theory called the third person effect. We would consider those people as easily influenced by media, whereas us, we're not that easily influenced. But not knowing that we are part of those people. So I'm interested in this partitioning of the I and the crowd. To me, the problematic that I'm trying to get at is that as you stand in front of that mirror, you notice that there is a separation between the I and the crowd. And, self-reflection has this paradoxical thing in a sense that the more you reflect upon it, the more you feel like you are overthinking things. And then you might begin to think that I'm just part of the crowd. I am those people, right? So despite this realization at the end that I'm part of the crowd, what intrigued me is that we would never arrive at another possible conclusion that the crowd is part of the I. And this is what I'm interested in exploring. When we know that the crowd and the I is separate, and then we think that perhaps we are part of the crowd, I'm part of the crowd, but we never arrive at the conclusion that the crowd is me. The crowd is part of me. So I'm trying to use certain examples, especially the case bearers, and also a lexicographer, to think about the possibility of how the crowd is actually part of the I. And in some scientific research about symbiosis, in fact, have kind of alluded to this idea that the crowd is part of me. Scott Gilbert, a historian and also a biologist, he wrote this paper with two colleagues titled A Symbiotic View of Life. We have never been individuals. Basically telling us the idea that, individuals are this romanticized notion. In fact, we are all constituted or co-constituted by separate singular entities. And consider, for example, our immune system, right? Our immune system, without external threats, our immune system will not develop. So there are certain latent possibilities in our bodies that has to be activated by external threats. So then what do we think of? What does it mean to say that there is a singular entity? So the singular is always already plural. We are all, to some extent, multitudes. So perhaps it's more useful to think of the I already as a compound. And I like the way you introduce myself. You're saying that I'm like a bundle. So we are all bundles, in fact. To think of the I as a compound, a bundle, and as if we're entering and living other I's or other selves. So as I'm speaking, for example, and you might be responding to some of my ideas. And at the same time, your facial expression, I'll be responding to your facial expression. And I might consider, for example, rephrasing some of my statements. So if we think about I's, various I's, as kind of intersecting, entering and living other compound I's, what is the implication of that in terms of how we relate to others, and what do we choose, the kind of actions or decisions that we commit ourselves to do? So the first example where I'm going to talk about the possibility of the crowd being part of the I is through the household case bearer. Okay, so the household case bearer is basically a type of creature. Sometimes it's called plaster bagworm. So it's a type of worm or caterpillar that is eventually will evolve into a moth, right? If you are familiar with, if you have been staying in tropical climates, you might be familiar with this kind of bagworms. Yeah, they hang at the edges of walls, ceilings, and they would gather household debris, household dust, yeah, to create their shells, their protective case. And throughout their life, before they transform into a moth, they have to bear these case. That is their home, their shelter. So this is how it looks like from close up. Yeah, the head, as you can notice, it's a sclerotized, hardened kind of brown head, and the body, the thorax, is actually white, so it's soft. Yeah, at the lower part of the body. So the kind of case that they create is actually soft on the inside. Yeah, kind of a cushion interior with craggy, hardy exterior. How do they do this? Is that they would start building the case with their silk, and with those silk, they would weave together different household dusts, discards from fragments of our hair, dead skin cells, or wall peels, and to weave together a case. Yeah. So I've been collecting these cases for a while now. From afar, they look like basically just droplets of gray, yeah, something that is uninteresting. But I think there's something that is very fascinating about the color of gray, the poetics of gray, the material poetics of grayness. To me, gray is the color of time, in a sense that think about gray as the color of the ash, right? And when we think about ash, it is something that has life forms being exposed to the vulnerabilities of time. But these cases, they're only gray from afar. When you zoom in close up, they become almost out of a sudden, there are colorful spots here and there, yeah, depending on the environment. There are browns, there are different shades of gray, but from afar, it's always just gray. I would like to think of gray as a color for time. In a sense that if we consider gray as a color for time, it is not necessarily a color that represents aging, but it's a color that represents a certain forms of entanglement. Yeah? So in that sense, we are trying to rethink what is considered as used, what is considered as new or old, right? Because something that is old, something that has been discarded, perhaps can be reused by case bearers to reconstitute something that is essentially new. Because these larvae are new forms of life, right? And they gathered materials from fragments of our decomposing selves, and also our decomposing homes, our decomposing shelters. So each larva carries a case of its own, and they're made of fragments of our dying and decomposing life. To me, when we talk about, for instance, notions of dying, notions of death and dying, notions of aging, we tend to attribute this label age or aging to elderly people. But that is actually a misconception, right? Even a 1 to 2 year old baby is still aging, right? So we are constantly aging in a sense that our cells are constantly reproducing to replace cells that are dying. So we are, as long as we're living, we are also dying. So when one person reached at the point where the cells couldn't regenerate to kind of exceed the cells that's being dying, then that person becomes sort of aged. But the moment we think about living and dying as a simultaneous impulse, then perhaps we could rethink what do we mean by the I. Yeah? The I, in a sense, is constituted by cells that is constantly recycling itself. So if you notice in that picture, there are fragments of kind of threads. Some are microfibrous materials, and some are actually human hair. Yeah, so those black color lines actually reflects the human hair, fragments of human hair. So basically, you can see that on the case itself, it is a reminder of our constant aging. Yeah, whatever that we have discarded at home, dust that we have discarded at home, unused, they use it and to create new forms of life. So I'm thinking about the making of home in the unmaking of home. These two cases also collected from my place, and I know that in my house there are specific walls that are painted in this color. So it's green with a slight blue tinge. So I immediately noticed that those are actually picked up from fragments of that particular wall, right? And it represents sort of their journey. So as they are expanding, as they are growing, they will also tear apart their case. If the case is too small, they will tear apart and they will start rebuilding those cases. So you can see rings of dust as a testament of time. And to me, they are conducting some forms of translation, right? It's not language translation, not linguistic translation, but material translation. What we have considered to be discards, useless, out of a sudden becomes useful. Discards becomes building blocks, and the overuse becomes something that is pristine, becomes something that is unused, that can undo what is being used in that sense. If you notice, there is a particular vertical slab that is actually an insect lake. So to some extent, the case is perhaps a landscape of like a graveyard, collecting things that are part of fragments of our dying life. Now, when we think about material translation, I am already alluding to this politics of use, the ideology of use, right? What do we consider as useful or useless, to me, tell us a lot about value judgment, and how our society has brought up different kinds of perspective that allows us to think about something as useful or useless, right? What is new and what is old? What is useful and what is useless and ready to be wasted and discarded? Right? If you think from a biopolitical sense, right, the older generations are considered to be a cause in the society because perhaps they have outlived their usefulness. Is that the kind of mindset or concept that we are kind of talking about, right? So what do we mean when something or someone becomes useless, right? Here I have examples of two pieces of papers. One is kind of new and the other is kind of old, crumble up. We might think of that as new and this as old, as used. But in fact, if we think about, say, if we are trees, if I'm a tree, from the perspective of a tree, the new paper is in fact old in a sense that it is being refined, processed, to become the bodies of a tree becomes a piece of paper. So what is considered to be a new piece of paper is in fact an old part of the tree. So what we define as new and old is always influenced and shaped by anthropocentric ideologies of what constitutes use. And I borrowed from the queer theorist Sarah Ahmed, who said that use is in fact a material restriction, a restriction of possibility that is material. When we think about what is useful and what is useless, we would consider that this is only useful because there is a specific intended purpose for the thing. But in fact, a thing can be so many other things. For example, my phone, it's not just a phone. My phone can be a paperweight, right? My phone can be a paperweight. And there's so many things that an object can be used beyond its intended purpose. Another example would be the CD. We no longer use CD today, right? But the CD is often, if you go to restaurants in Malaysia, the CD is sometimes hang with this fan to create this fly repellent. So the material possibility of the CD allows us to use the CD without actually using the intended purpose of that CD. So now it is used as a fly repellent instead of as a CD. So that then, as a fly repellent, the CD becomes new instead of something that is useless, right? So by questioning the labels of what is useful and useless, we are also questioning a lot of different value judgments in our society, including what is new, what is old, what is young, what is fresh, and what is kind of wasted. So to me, the fact that the case bearers contain all these rings of dust, it stands as this witness of our modern times. They are like rings in a tree. They're like tree rings, but these are rings of dust, allowing us to understand how life forms have moved on, being carried forward. And as they grow, they would again tear apart their cases and rebuild new materials using existing discarded waste from our house to create this kind of amazing shape that is in a spindle fusiform, like cocoon-like shape. And to some extent, it also stands as a reminder that we are always dying. So dust is really our destiny. And dust is where we are heading towards as different forms of life. We are always moving towards becoming dust. This is actually a close-up of a case bearer, a surface of case bearer. And here you can see that there is a skin of a dust mite. That's a dust mite. So again, the case bearer constantly reminds us of the possibility that it is a graveyard comprising different forms of organic and synthetic materials being entangled. So it is sort of the great equalizer, the great ontological equalizer. It evens out all these different asymmetrical relations that we have between humans and between different matters, living or dead. So I'm trying to think about a theory of what I call moth-eaten futures. By calling it moth-eaten futures, I'm trying to obviously create a paradoxical term that we could perhaps through it learn about ways of becoming, of coping with future. By moth-eaten futures, when we think about future is always something, you know, that it's distant, new, fresh, right? Something that is futuristic, speculative. Whereas moth-eaten is usually an adjective that is used to describe something that is used, something that is old, something that has been eaten by moth. Yeah, and I think that is itself quite interesting, yeah, as a label, because we would only see these creatures as damaging human properties, so we call it moth-eaten. Yeah, not knowing that the moth need to eat some of our materials in order to survive. Yeah. So the way we use moth-eatenness to describe something as old and used is already a very human-centric perspective. So by kind of conceptualizing this label, moth-eaten futures, I'm trying to think about how we have to acknowledge a certain futured futures, yeah, futures that is already futured, but we are perhaps unaware of it. We are unaware of the material possibilities of perhaps our dead skin cells. We are unaware of the material possibilities of our organs. Yeah? Who will it feed? Who will our bodies feed in the future? We don't know, but there is this possibility. Yeah? So in recognition of our futured futures, and also to see perhaps ourselves as an ongoing dust clouds. In fact, we are all dust clouds. We are all clouds of dust, in a sense that wherever we move, we are always shedding hair and skins. We're always leaving trails of dust around us. Whenever there are humans, there will be dust. Yeah? The very phrase of dusting, what does dusting mean? We might think that dusting is to clean up dust, right? But dusting is also to apply dust on top of something. So it's always already ambivalent. Yeah? And there's no such thing as cleaning up, right? We can't really clean up something. We are only relocating dust from a place to another. And to some extent, dusting, by cleaning up a space, it is almost as if we are not refuse to acknowledge the fact that we are in fact mortals, we are in fact dying, we are in fact decomposing, and therefore we create dust, right? So by creating dust and then we are removing those dust that we have created, we are trying to refuse or deny the condition of mortality. So this is the kind of possibility about rethinking time or the times of modernity by using this label, moth-eaten futures. So next example is, again, to think about how the crowd is part of me is through the use of a lexicographer, through the case of a lexicographer, about portable worlds. Okay. So let me begin with this wonderful short essay by Ursula Le Guin, a science fiction writer. So Le Guin wrote this essay. It's called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. Now she was talking about how he was creating a kind of writing about a speculative history of how we have arrived at specific conventions when it comes to narrative structure. Now to her, when we tell stories, we are always telling stories about stories that have interesting climatic moments, conflicts, tension, and then a conflict resolution. So she was questioning why is conventional narrative structure shaped in this way? Why must we have conflicts and then conflict resolution? What constitute an interesting storyline? So she was trying to question that. Yeah, he was saying that perhaps in the past, during the hunters and gatherers society, in a primitive society where we are hunters and gatherers, imagine it when hunters and gatherers departed from their house, and one would hunt animals and the other would be gathering foodstuff, from plants to seeds to oats, with bags. And when they both come back to home, to their houses, you might imagine the kind of stories that they share, right? And one would easily imagine that the stories that hunters are telling would be more compelling, exciting, thrilling than stories that the gatherers would be sharing. So as a result of that, Ursula Le Guin speculating that end up we have this kind of conventional narrative structures that prioritize violence, conflict, tension, and conflict resolution at the end, because the stories of gatherers are simply not so interesting. But to her, the stories of gatherers are in fact stories of great importance. Because before we learn how to kill and hunt, we must learn how to gather. We must learn how to contain things, to put things in our containers and to collect them and to gather them, right? That's what we have to collect energy before we exert, before we kill and truss and spear the animals. So she was talking about a different kinds of storytelling that is perhaps more important, and that is the story of carrying stuff, carrying the world, of containing the world. So we could perhaps begin to learn to think about how the world is a bag. The world is a bag in a sense that we are all living on this planet Earth. So it's carrying us, but also the bag as a world, as we are carrying handbags and different forms of school bags, we are also carrying a world around us. And this is also an equivalence of I am part of the crowd, and also the crowd is part of me. Yeah, this is a still from Modern Times for those who just joined. So, in fact, dictionary is a kind of world. And if we look at the invention of dictionaries or the technology, dictionary as a form of technique of collecting, dictionary as a technique of gathering words, vocabulary, dictionaries are mostly pocket-sized. And these pocket-sized dictionaries are highly, highly profitable. Usually the popular dictionaries are pocket-sized because they can be carried along. So when you are speaking to someone in a foreign, on a foreign place, yeah, and you might refer to the dictionary and you might, say certain words. So I have been looking into these dictionaries for a while. These dictionaries are actually Malay dictionaries. They're Malay dictionaries that are written in Chinese characters, which means that if you can't read the Chinese characters, you won't be able to read these Malay dictionaries, even if you're in Malay. So there are a number of these dictionaries, usually what I would call Sino-Malay dictionaries, Malay dictionaries or Malay word lists written in Chinese characters. It was just like Malay today, more commonly written in Rumi, in the Romanized script. But Malay before Romanization was actually written in the Arabic script, which is called Jawi. So these are Malays written in the Chinese script. And it is usually published and distributed by overseas Chinese, by Chinese print entrepreneurs that would print these materials and they would sell it to the new Chinese migrants. So these dictionaries are collected by a single person, a lexicographer, which is the case that I'm trying to explore. His name is Yang Gui. You can find some of these dictionaries now in the Center for Malaysian Chinese Studies, which is located at the Chinese Assembly Hall, and also at UKM in Bangi. So these are just some examples of those dictionaries that are actually Malay dictionaries. So just an example of how these Malay dictionaries are actually written in Chinese and how do they transcribe the pronunciation. This is back in the 15th century. So lei on the left, it says thunder, so it's ulu, which means guru. Wind, angin, so it means angin. Angin in Malay, it's wind. Yeah. And aside from vocabulary, it also has phrases. So yes or no, I'm referring to the first one. This one, hang hang. So here it says in Cantonese, Molay data. So it's like boleh tidak. Yeah. So there's obviously there's some limitation when you use Chinese characters to translate to transcribe the Malay language. And then also here this particular line, Koi hai jingga gayan, he's a wretched person. Leya cilaka panya orang. Yeah, which in Malay means dear celaka punya orang. He's a terrible person. Yeah, so the dictionary is kind of like a word list or phrase list. Yeah, it doesn't just explain or describe something, but it contains different phrases that are commonly used back then. So, but my main point today is on the person that is collecting all this dictionary. And his name is Yang Gui. He was born in 1930s and recently passed away last year. So he's actually a self-taught lexicographer. He's also a translator. And he is a passionate collector of Malay and Indonesian books. And he's so passionate about collecting that his book collection made him into a political detainee when he was just at the age of 19, because he has too much books that it creates suspicion from the colonial officers. So he was born as a second generation Chinese from rubber plantation. So he has been working as a rubber tapper in a very kind of a poor family. Yeah. So he has been tapping rubber early in the morning. And there's something about rubber tapping, something about rubber plantation that I'm also interested in exploring when we're talking about time. Because to me, plantation itself, yeah, as a technique of control, of controlling bodies, of disciplining bodies, in fact, is a seizure of time, a seizure of bodies and of life itself. Yeah? Plantation requires that we work for a specific colonial system of extraction. Plantation refers to this idea that we have to wake up early to tap the rubber, because if you are late, then the rubber will not be, usable. So to tap rubber, you must wake up before dawn and tap it so that it flows to that specific pot to ensure that it is in liquid form. So there is an element of timekeeping and time management that is involved in the rubber plantation itself. And this life experience, this plantation experience, shaped Yang Gui, our lexicographer, and the way he responds to the time of language and the temporalities of language change. So he became a political detainee, as I've mentioned. When he was studying in Singapore, the Chinese high school, Hua Zhong, today, he kept a number of books in his bedroom. And he has been buying so many books that he has to hide some of the books. He's not even hiding. He was putting it on bookshelves, and because there's not enough space, so he has to put it underneath the bed. Yeah. And during that time, in colonial times, there were, communist insurgency. So the police was always suspecting the Chinese was doing something fishy. So when there's a spot check around the school, and they notice that Yang Gui's room contains such huge amount of books, they immediately suspect that he is a communist, he is an activist or something. Yeah. So he was detained, arrested by the colonial officers for a few months. And that eventually politicized him, made him a radical. Yeah. Throughout his life, in his memoir, he always said that he doesn't want to be political, but when you get detained and arrested, right, and he doesn't have the freedom to do what he intends to do, then he became political. So from plantation life to living a life as a detainee, if you read his memoir, there's always this sense to me that Yang Gui is often struggling with time. To him, he always wanted to learn Malay. It is always his passion, but he couldn't have enough time to learn Malay. What he did is he always collect Malay words that he found on Malay journals, Malay magazines, and Malay newspapers, and he would just jot down every single vocabulary on his notebooks, on his kind of buku latihan, the exercise books. Yeah. And over time, he began to know that maybe he should start writing dictionaries, and that's how it began. So from a person who doesn't know Malay, who's illiterate in Malay, out of a sudden becomes a Malay lexicographer, someone who is collecting words. So he frequently collaborated with his partner and wife, Chan Mawa, who is also a translator. To date, he has published almost 17 dictionaries, 17 dictionaries. And his first project took him 10 to 20 over years to complete, because of certain technological change. So there's something about time that I find really interesting when it comes to his career as a lexicographer. So this is usually known as the trilogy, his trilogy. He prepared this huge project to publish what is titled Kamus Umum Bahasa Malaysia, which was published in 1972. But he has been working on it for about 20 over years. But because of the change of time and change of technologies, he has to eventually publish the one in the middle, so Kamus Singkatan. So this was actually published first in 1969. So this was published first. This is the first publication. This is their second publication, and this is the third publication, and subsequently a few more. But to Yang and to his wife, they intend this Kamus Umum, which is the main dictionary, to be read as the main work, and this too as supplementary. Yeah, it is supplementary because this is Kamus Singkatan, means a list of abbreviation, whereas this one, Kamus Istilah Baru, it means new terms in the Malay vocabulary. Now, when he's collecting words, for his huge project that spans almost 20 over years, he struggled with time, as I mentioned. And what kind of struggle that he faced? So when he was writing the dictionary, he is a self-taught lexicographer. So there's no one systematic way of actually compiling words. He just write it using index cards, and you would gradually then rearrange those cards to write his own handwritten drafts for the book. Now, back then in the 1950s and 1960s, in order to print a book, you have to go to Hong Kong. Because Singapore and Malaysia, West Malaysia or Malaya, we did not have the technology to print some of these books. So what happens is that he would have to send his handwritten drafts to Hong Kong, and because they're using letterpress, right? Letterpress is something like this, which means that when it's sent to Hong Kong, they have to arrange each punctuation, each alphabet to form a page of dictionary. And a dictionary is about 1,000 over pages, right? So imagine the kind of letter that you have to set, the typesetting label that you have to work on in order to create a page. And once the type has been set in Hong Kong, they will print it in Hong Kong, and they will send the proof back to Malaya so that the compiler could check. And when he checked, he noticed that because Hong Kong people do not know Malay, so they commit a lot of mistakes, right? So when you correct the proof, you have to send the proof back to Hong Kong, and they will have to reset the type and print again and send back from Hong Kong to Malaya. So the time taken, this back and forth, to that extent that by the time he completed the entire dictionary, the Malay language itself has changed, right? Because language is constantly shifting. So how do you make sure that your dictionary is in time? So he constantly wants to keep up with time. He always revises his dictionary. But the problem with time is that when you try to keep up with time, when you're publishing a dictionary that's up to date, it also means that the dictionary can be easily out of date. Because a term that exists today might just disappear tomorrow, right? So a lot of dictionaries tend to wait for a few more years before they decide to incorporate the internet slang into their dictionary, their broader corpus. But Yang doesn't think like that. He thinks that whatever words that he found in the Malay journals has to be included. So simply by keeping up in time, he was kind of keeping out of time. So he's always late for something. And this is something that perhaps if we could tie it back to his plantation life and the idea of timekeeping, always constantly kind of obsessed with keeping up with time. That is perhaps something that we can think about. How did Yang Kui relate with the temporality of perhaps moth-eaten futures? So from this Kamus Umum, the first project, to the second Kamus Umum, a revised edition, and then there's this is actually his most popular publication, especially among the Xynophone publics in Malaysia, Kamus Sari Ejam Bersama. So when during again the change of technologies and when everything has to be computerized, he has to use word processor, print out and cut out words and stick it back in order to print using offset lithography. So every time when there's a technological change. He has to always keep up with time. And as a lexicographer who's trying to keep up with time, he's always on the lookout for new words in the Malay language. Yeah. So at a point in time when he was rearranging these words with cow gum back then, where you have to cut up and glue, stick together lines with every single words, the publisher couldn't handle him. That the publisher eventually asked him to do the editing himself. So he's not only the editor, he's also the he's also the pasting, he's also doing the pasting job himself. So as he's doing that, he also take that opportunity to also add in words and also reduce, eliminate certain words or change the phrases and definitions of a dictionary whenever he deems fit. So he's basically doing everything all by himself, which again increases the duration for publishing a dictionary. So by the time when a dictionary is published, it's outdated, right? So there's always this paradox of time. And finally, I'm going to talk about how, once we've talked about the Casebearers and the rings of dust and the kind of time, and then we've also talked about Yang Kui's lexicography. I want to think about how, in these two cases, we could see the portable dictionaries as portable worlds, and also the Casebearers as also kind of carrying its own portable worlds, and how they create their own world, and that worlding itself is a form of weirding. So first, the Malay word kamus, in fact, derived from the Arabic word kamus, which actually means the ocean. And I find that a very apt way of beginning to talk about dictionary as a form of worlding and as a form of weirding. And in fact, Yang Kui himself, as a lexicographer, to travel to Hong Kong to work on his dictionary, he has been traveling across the sea. So wording, in fact, or wording is quite weird, yeah, because as the world becomes volatile, as language is constantly shifting, you are shaped by influences beyond your immediate control. So when he was working on the first project, the publisher in Hong Kong took such a long time that they decided that if you don't publish it soon, we will stop the contract and we will pay whatever compensation for you, because it took almost 10 to 20 years. Yeah, there was some delay when he published the first dictionary, then the second dictionary in 1972, because first Kamus Dewan published, which is the official Malay dictionary in Malaysia, it was published in 1970. So that created a huge impact to his dictionary, because now he has to refer to the Kamus Dewan. Yeah, he has been working on it, his big masterpiece, since the 1960s. But then Malaysian government published an official dictionary in 1970, the first edition of Kamus Dewan. So he has to revise. Yeah. So, but the publisher couldn't stand it. So the publisher just saying that you can change everything, but we can't change the alphabet A. So the entries in the alphabet for the alphabet A has to be fixed. So if you check his first few projects, the first entry for the alphabet A is sort of transfixed in time. It's like fossil, whereas the others are kind of more up to date. Yeah. So the weirdly weird world that we lived in has brought non-human realities, human history, and geological time together in ways that deeply contradict our sense of reality. And I feel that this is, in fact, what any lexicographers will experience. When you craft a dictionary, there will be moments in time where there are some terms and vocabularies that you can't incorporate. Yeah. How do you then deal with time? So the reminder of time and the reminder of being in time, and also the risk of being out of time, is always there. So there's something about weirding that is, to me, always starts in the middle. Mackenzie Wark, also a queer theorist, said that, like every weird global media events, the story began in the middle, right? If you look at this GIF, you see cats kind of in conflict with each other, but the cats was taking a revenge slap on the other cats, not knowing that it is actually the other cat that is doing the harm. So all weird media events begin in the middle. Yeah, in fact, all events that we know, that we recognize and acknowledge, begins in the middle, right? Because we always have access to an event that is already in the middle. We don't know what is the cause of that cause. We don't know what is the conditions or possibilities for that conditions to happen. So we always begin in the middle. And in that sense, when events always begin in the middle, events are always weird. Now, if Evelyn Chen, a linguist, a linguistic historian, he wrote this book called Weird English. Yeah, she considered globalized English as weird English. Perhaps instead of thinking about Yang Gui's dictionary as out of time, perhaps we could think about his dictionary as a legacy of weird Malays. So by weirding English, what Evelyn Chen was talking about is that he considers weirding as a decolonial approach, diasporic non-native approach that accounts for aesthetic adventurousness of a language. So when a language is adventurous, yeah, it is experimental, it is going against the orthodox kinds of English. And the same thing goes with weird Malay. Yeah. So weirding begins in the middle against the privileging of the roots. In fact, if you look at some of his dictionaries, he often incorporates the latest words, the latest terms in his Malay dictionaries, including in his preface, he always talk about the, the, the challenge of trying to include loan words, especially. Yeah, loan words abound. Where does one language begin and another end? Yeah, if you read this quote, it says that the aim of editing a dictionary is to make sure that it is useful, but you also have to kind of include loan words, borrowed terms from other languages. And therefore, in this Malay dictionary, you'll find Chinese, Hindi, Portuguese, Spanish, and other terms as well. And you can see here that the I and the U is in fact part of the Malay dictionary. Yeah, so these are English terms, but what does it mean when you include them as part of the Malay dictionary? What is Malay, right? What is English? In fact, the official Kamus Dewan also included I and U, but most of the loan words that are not included in the official dictionary is included by him. So when people ask, why do you include even English terms like I and you? Yeah, his explanation is that younger Malays are using these terms very commonly. So when the Malays are using the term, right, when they write it on journals, on magazines, it means that it has entered into the Malay vocabulary. Yeah, so he's not gatekeeping the Malay language. But if we're looking into the official Malay dictionary, yeah, national institutions tend to gatekeep language. What is a Malay language? But he doesn't. So if you compare his entry of over and the Kamus Dewan entry for over, overdraft, this is Kamus Dewan, this is the official dictionary. There is only one word with over, whereas in Yang Gui's dictionary, even over, an English word, is considered to be a Malay word, and which means terlampau, so sort of over, overdraft, overture, overwork. Yeah, so these are all included in Yang Gui's Malay dictionary, but it's not included in the official National Malay Dictionary. And they're quite proud of it, right? To them, a lexicographer should be descriptivist instead of prescriptivist. You should describe what a language is instead of prescribing what a language should be. So to Chamawo, his wife, and here I'm translating, she mentioned this in Malay, but in English, she said, our dictionaries contain new words published in newspapers and magazines. We included many of those words that Dewan Bahasa did not. So they're quite proud of the fact that their dictionaries are in fact more comprehensive, and it includes even the latest terms that our national institutions choose not to include. And perhaps their unruly trilogy, yeah, perhaps is a way of thinking about the middle. The fact that they publish the first, the fact that they publish the second first, right? The middle first. This is supposed to be the first publication, if you still recall, right? But they end up publishing their second publication, which is supposed to be read as a sequel to the main publication. Yeah, perhaps tell us something about the moth-eaten futures of the Malay language. It perhaps tells us something about how language cannot be contained, that is always ahead of us. Yeah? It is sort of future. So perhaps this trilogy suggests to us a belated publication of the first and the two addendums, or it's a lesson about how to begin with the middle. And in fact, Yang Gui himself, he is an embodiment of the middle. He also published this book, but using a pseudonym called Titian Shah. And we know what Titian means. Titian means bridge, which is a middle. right? So the embodiment of the middle, this book was actually published for children, and he sees himself as the bridging device between Chinese and Malay. So he sees himself as the middle person. So last slide. So perhaps by looking into these different cases, by thinking about the household case bearers and its moth-eaten futures, and also by thinking about Yang Gui as a lexicographer, perhaps we can think about how worlding itself is weirding, and we always begin in the middle, yeah, and think about how case bearers and lexicographers always help us in carrying on, carrying forward, and also to carry us across another world and to access through the bridge another world that is kind of inaccessible to us. So with this, I'll end my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zi Hao, for the insights. It's very compelling. Let's open the room for discussion. Any questions from the crowd, perhaps?
Yeah.
You actually, first one very boring, but it's thanks to the fact that I don't know any Malay. What is the meaning of, is it kamus?
Kamus is Malay, means dictionary.
I thought so, okay. I didn't know that. And second, again, maybe it's a slightly boring question, but I was perplexed that he had to send stuff to Hong Kong because I thought there was a printing press available in Malacca.
Yes, there were, but the printing press in Malacca, I think they were printing mostly leaflets, posters, not so much with more ambitious projects such as dictionary. Okay. So for dictionary, I think the printing capacity has to be different. And you're printing a thick book with multiple copies.
Thank you. I had a third question, but it escaped my mind, so maybe. Thanks a lot for your fascinating talk.
Thanks.
I have a very simple question. When we see a termite in our house, we often think that something we need to throw away or maybe quickly kill it, execute it from living in our living quarters. It's never crossed my mind how it's compelling, but I'm interested to know what draws you to see them in different angle.
What made me? I've been seeing this creature, the household case bearer, for a while, right? Since because it's always at home, but the specific moment where I began to take it as a subject for my art practice is that there are a few things. I was doing my postgraduate studies, so I was moving around across different countries, Malaysia, I was studying in Singapore, and I was doing fieldwork in Indonesia. And as I move around, I noticed this creature in every single place. And when I return home, I noticed there is a huge increase of household case bearers at home. And I noticed that my house has become dusty. And I stay with my parents, so I noticed that my parents often like to clean up their place. But out of a sudden, dust begins to accumulate. And when you're away from home, right, and when you return, you immediately notice that there is a stark difference. And that's also where I noticed that my parents are aging. Because after a few years, when you return, you notice the age difference. And the house begins to accumulate dust. So for I know that my parents like to clean up, as I said, right? But for them, even if they like to clean up, there's some limitation because they are getting old. So they couldn't clean up certain corners. So it gets dustier and dustier. So when I look at these creatures, it makes me think about dust. It makes me think about life and also aging, the idea of aging. What does that mean when when these case bearers are their population has increased, whereas my parents are aging? So there's some kind of material translation that's happening, as if the aging of my parents is actually giving birth to new forms of life.
Thank you for the very thoughtful answer. Have you got any other questions from the crowd?
Going from her question,
yeah.
How long did it take for you to come up with this whole conception throughout the process? How long did it take from the case bearers to Mr.
Yang? I've been looking into language for many years. So I think my key interest in looking at language is, initially I was interested in loan words, borrowed words. So I'm always questioning linguistic boundaries. So I see already language as a composite, as a chimerical figure, as a compound, as a bundle. And then moving from language, away from language, I begin to look into other kinds of creatures, like imaginary creatures. So I did something about these mythical animals called makara, that is a composite animal that is constituted by other animals. I've also then looked into this case bearer, also as a composite of other things. So even if I'm moving from a case to another, I'm still working around the same topic about the condition of being singular and plural at the same time, and how the self, the I, is actually the crowd.
So you can say show your practice.
I've been practicing for, I think, maybe college times, 20, 20.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Third question came back into my head. Do you find it in some ways problematic to be descriptive rather than prescriptive? Generally speaking, in the practice of language, particularly in book publishing, in an era where, comparing with what's happening in my own country with my own language, which is not English, it's the language I learned when I was 14, started learning, but when you have lots of certain kinds of media and certain books are so insanely more popular than others, then if you have poor translation, and by poor, here I'm already kind of judgmental, but let's say literally a publishing house would do AI plus Google Translate. As a result, the language that is being created by what from a translation practice would be poor translation, I think, becomes the standard language. So therefore, by being descriptive, you're normalizing language, which is lack of language capability and sensibility from the point of view of academia, let's say, or even just the actual authors, which is even more problematic.
The way I see language is that, to me, language exists and language happens. And then when language happens, we have modern institutions trying to document and record its boundary. So the national institutions are the aftermath of language. Language exists first, and then we have institutions trying to control that language and contain it by saying that this is the boundaries of language. But before these institutions, the language exists. So in that sense, to me, Malay language exists before Malaysia, right? All so-called national language today exists before the invention of the nation. But the invention of the nation nationalized a language. So for example, Indonesia speaks Malay language, Malaysia speaks Malay language, but Indonesia, when they achieve independence, they have to Indonesianize the Malay language by creating or documenting words that are more Javanized, more non-Malaysian Malay, to create its own Indonesian national language to separate from the Malaysian Malay. So to me, the idea of prescribing language is always after the fact, right? There is a certain body of work that has been misused, and abused, and then you have institutions and government coming in trying to monitor what is the appropriate use of language. But that is always later. To me, it's a way in which a country or government trying to contain the fluidity or the anarchism of language. But language to me is always radical. You can't really control it. You can control it only in the form of a dictionary, but every time when a dictionary is published, in my opinion, it's already outdated because language change faster than what a dictionary could document. Yeah. the optimal sense breeding, humidity and dust. So I think there are a lot of bagworms, whether it's domestic or outdoor. So the outdoor bagworms, they are usually instead of gathering household dust, they would gather dead leaves, dried leaves, and grass to create its own shelter. It just so happens that the domestic household case bearers, that's why it's called household case bearer, because it's inside our house, they are used to collecting human dust. So probably they have evolved and they have adapted to our domestic spaces. Mm. 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 There is this possibility. In fact, there is an artist in Japan who created this kind of work where she would collaborate with bagworms, not this household case bearers, but with bagworms, where she supplied kind of textiles. So it's very fashionable. Yeah. But to me, I did not want to have that intentionality involved in. So the cases that I've collected are usually found objects. So for example, there's a blue case. I don't know if you noticed, there's a blue tinge case. That case is actually found in a blue mansion in Penang. So the blue paint from the wall from a heritage building was kind of peeling off. So the case bearer is kind of using those to create its own case. So I see it as found objects instead of intentionally curate the colors of the case. Mm. Yeah, yeah. Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
who mentioned it? Zi mentioned.
Yeah, Chongfazi.
Can you share the name of the artist you mentioned for? Japanese artist.
Yeah, Japanese Aki something. Yeah, she's quite well known. In fact, even scientists have this is from the Chongfazi mansion. This is from the Blue Mansion in Penang. Yeah. So even scientists who studied household case bearers, there are a few entomologists in Taiwan who studied this, and they have experimented with it. So they provide their own fibrous materials. So if they are isolated from their natural environment, they can actually use other materials to form their own case.